Hi, welcome to this video. In this video, you'll hear about the topic of adverse childhood experiences. There may be sensitive topics mentioned throughout this video, so if at any point you don't feel comfortable about it, just stop, have a cup of tea, and relax yourself. Going back to the topic of this video, you may wonder, what are ACEs exactly? Adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, are negative experiences that can happen throughout childhood. They can be categorized into two types. First, we have traumatic events. Traumatic events are all those events that cause a lot of recurrent stress to the child. Examples of traumatic events are physical abuse, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse, but not only. Then we have the second category, which is household dysfunction. This category indicates all those home situations that have to some extent problematic or different from the normal ways of functioning in a household. Examples of household dysfunctions are divorce or separation, domestic violence, or living with adults who are suffering from a mental illness. Researchers have identified some child and family characteristics which often happen together with ACEs. The 5 most common characteristics co-occurring with ACEs are children's age, whether they need special health care or not, their family structure, the family's income level, and health insurance status. Also, the highest prevalence rates of ACEs is found to be related to economic hardships. Imagine a child suffering from ACEs. They may have difficulties completing education or attaining to a higher education level. This can possibly lead to distress or failure in finding or maintaining a job. And understandably, they may end up still in an economic hardship. This is the so-called intergenerational continuity. Parents' economic status continues to influence their children's future in any aspect related to economic situation. The next question is, what are the consequences of exposure to ACEs? About this question, I guess you may be familiar with these kinds of content on social media, whether it's something like this, or like this.
Promise I won't push you straight to the dirt. If you promise me you'll take them all first. I love everything you do. When you call me fucking dumb for the stupid shit I do. Wanna run my back with you. Fully undressed, no trailers left for you. I'll call them off for you.
However, are these videos reliable? Are they really based on evidence? Do they tell us the truth? Actually, no. But does this mean that there are no long-term consequences for ACEs? Again, the answer is no. So, what is true then? As you may be curious about this question, psychologists are also interested in whether these relationships really exist and how ACEs impact our life. By comparing children exposed to ACEs and those who were not, they did find relationships between exposure to ACEs and children's physical and mental health. However, the connection between ACEs and children's health depends on what aspect of health we're looking at. For instance, the strongest relationship lies between ACEs exposure and the problematic drug use and interpersonal and self-directed violence. As for physical health, like physical exercise, diabetes, or obesity, the research shows weak relationships of ACEs and them. You may wonder, but what does this actually mean? Well, this means that ACEs rarely lead to physical health problems. The study also tells us, compared to people without ACEs, at least 4 different ACEs have to be present on someone to have a considerable higher risk for health issues. So, this implies that ACEs may not be that powerful to have a negative consequence on people, especially when we look at physical health. Another thing we need to consider is there really a causal relationship between ACEs and the negative well-being on people? Wait, but what is a causal relationship? Causal relationships tell us if one event or phenomenon is something that really results in the outcomes we're interested in. In the topic of ACEs, If someone suffers from negative outcomes, like mental illness or drug use, we tend to think ACEs are the only or main cause. However, there may still be other factors contributing to one's well-being. For example, genetic factors, cultures, and individual differences. In addition, protective factors such as peer relationships can also reduce the influence of ACEs. In this way, we cannot conclude that ACEs really are the factors leading to negative health. Rather, we must take many more related elements into consideration. Another typical content you may often see on social media is the ones that help you calculate the number or seriousness of the ACEs and analyze the possible outcomes, like this video.
I'm not going to tell you what this is until the very end, but put a finger down if any of these happened to you before your 18th birthday. Put a finger down if a parent or an adult in your household humiliated you, insulted you, swore at you, or made you feel physically unsafe. If a parent or an adult in your household kicked, slapped, punched, or threw objects at you with intentions of hurting you. Someone at least 5 years older than you sexually abused you. You felt that there was no love in your family and no one would be there to support you. You were worried about where your next meal would come from. You often had to wear dirty clothes, or your parents were too negligent to take you to the doctor. If your parents were ever separated or divorced, if a parental figure experienced domestic violence. If you lived with anyone who had an addiction. If anyone in your household experienced mental illness, attempted suicide, or was depressed. If anyone in your immediate household was incarcerated. What I just read to you was the ACE test, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences test. This is something that psychologists use to determine if someone may have developed PTSD at a young age. If you've experienced 4 or more of these, your childhood was considered adverse.
This video seems to tell you a lot about your ACEs exposure and consequences. But have you ever wondered, if this video is true on this information, why do we bother to do psychological testing or questionnaires? This is the point. The questionnaires or skills on social media may not be true or reliable. In the video, we can find flaws that make the questions not proper to be sources to understand your ACEs. First, as mentioned, other factors like stressors outside the household may impact one's ACEs, but the questions in video do not include any of them. The video also does not check protective factors and individual differences, so the questions in it may not be able to examine ACEs on all people. Second, the video asks people to recall their experiences in childhood, but our memories fade in their quality over time and are easily to be influenced based on our emotions and new experiences. So, the retrospective reports relying on recalling past events on those questions probably are not reliable and may bias the results. Third, the skill may not apply to different cultures. For example, parenting in Asian families often incorporates non-supportive skills, but these parenting skills are often perceived as love and care in Asian cultures. If we realize that and look back to the questions in the video, we can imagine that Asian people may score higher on the questions, even though that does not necessarily mean they suffer more on ACEs. Now that there is overwhelming information about ACEs, and sometimes it is really hard to tell which is right and which is wrong. But as an adolescent, what can you do? Awareness is the first and the very important step. Remember, what you see on social media is not always true. The thing is, a lot of them are made up or just myths. Pay attention to the source of the information. Try to ask yourself, where does the information come from? How do we know if it is true when people say they are doctors or experts on this topic? Critically think about the content. Is there any other possibility or reason leading to the consequences they're talking about? Does the conclusion they make always apply to people and situations? Is it possible that the content is not correct? So, share this information with others, like your friends and families. In conclusion, when we look more into the topic and related studies of ACEs, we can find that although adverse childhood experiences can lead to higher risk for negative development, they do not make one's life doomed to disastrous outcomes. The environment and the individual's perceptions can be changed, and successful efforts can be made for more positive youth development.